Welcome to the Six Hats podcast, where I, Dr. Shami, a lifestyle and nutritional medicine family doctor, will talk about how women strive to find balance each day by juggling their six roles, being a woman, mother, daughter, partner, business owner, and professional. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Six Hats podcast, and I'm loving this next conversation. I can't wait for you to hear it. It's with Richard Game. He is the founder of Vital Origin. Now, he's also a functional medicine practitioner, physiotherapist, performance coach, and biohacker. Now, he's spent years studying and applying the principles of ancestral health, nose-to-tail diets, and evolutionary medicine to himself and to help others. Now, over the years, he has become more and more passionate about helping not only people through natural superfoods, but the planet through sustainability and regenerative agriculture. Hence, Vital Origin was born to accomplish both goals. So welcome, Richard.
Thank you so much. That was a great introduction. Thank you, Shami.
Awesome. So Richard, I'm going to start with your story. And I think my listeners love listening to how did you become so passionate about functional medicine and eventually leading to the launch of Vital Origin?
Sure. So quite a varied background, but in the health space, I guess it all started from quite a young age. I was fortunate to always be kind of in sports, and with that comes being mindful of your health always. And my family was always very health conscious. So that's always been in the back of my mind from a very young age, which I was very fortunate about. And over the years, being in athletics and those types of things, I was always trying to sort of optimize myself, trying to have better nutrition, better performance. And eventually that leads you into studying a broad range of things. And I actually came across the paleo diet very early on, pretty much when it first early Lauren Cordain and Rob Wolf worked. So I was automatically drawn to that because it seemed to me to make just common sense. It seemed very straightforward, and that sort of opened the world into the evolutionary framework. And so that resonated with me very strongly, and I've continued to bring that with me in my learning over the years. And eventually, my passion for the human body and biology and movement and all these types of things led me to study it in academics. So I did my undergraduate in Canada in kinesiology, which in Canada, that's more like human movement and nutrition sciences. And I did quite a heavy focus and specialized focus in biology and physiology and exercise physiology. And that broadened my world and curiosity even more into biology and the human body, very much down to, the smallest bits. So molecular biology, I found just absolutely fascinating, studied a lot of things in that space. And so that eventually led me to continuing education. I did a lot of advanced courses. I was doing nutrition on the side. I was doing strength and conditioning on the side. So I started to work with clients in that space, more in just general health, fitness, nutrition, and then eventually led to doing a master's degree in physiotherapy. And funny enough, at that time, I was actually back and forth between going into natural medicine and naturopathy, which for us in Canada is actually a full 5-year medical degree. I was actually very heavily focused and interested in movement and movement sciences at that time. And being an athlete, I've had many, many injuries. And so I worked with lots of physios and osteos and those types of things. So I was drawn towards that and got into that space. But during going into those studies, I was actually also doing studies for functional medicine. So I had done functional diagnostic nutrition certification early on, which again, that opened up a little bit more into functional testing and looking at functional biochemistry and those types of things. And then as I was going through my degree, I then shifted and started doing the training with the IFM, the Institute for Functional Medicine. Yeah, so I did the initial training through there and some of their advanced courses. And so that's sort of the academic intellectual component. But over the years, probably due to a lifestyle of too much sport, overtraining, very type A personality, probably pushing a little too hard in certain spaces, I started to develop some of my own symptoms. And actually, with the knowledge I have now, I realize I probably had quite a few early on. And so I have a very typical atopic presentation. I've always dealt with asthma, allergies, skin issues, those types of things. And then eventually IBS. And I had IBS for quite a long time. And I went through the usual rounds of, chat to the doctor, see another doctor, didn't get any results. And I was fortunate enough to finally find a functional medicine naturopath in Toronto, where I'm from. And that sort of broadened my scope. I discovered, I've had parasites, I had a bit of SIBO. There was a few things going on, which opened it up right away and got to the root cause and then addressed that. And I saw a profound shift in my own health. And so that was very much an aha moment. And I saw the benefit and power of a functional medicine approach and a more systems holistic based approach I just felt compelled to learn more about that and then also apply those concepts to the people I was working with. And so when I eventually got into clinical practice, then I took those frameworks with me. And it's really allowed me to help people at a very different level from the conventional approaches that, my fellow colleagues maybe look at, just because of the advanced training in nutrition, sleep, stress, and all of those things, and how they tie into someone's experience of whether it's pain or other symptoms.
Amazing. But I'd love to know, so how did he eventually launch Vital Origin? And by the way, I'm loving the tallow. Love the tallow. And I actually advise patients to let's go back to healthy fats. And this is awesome. And I've been trying to find a good tallow. So Vital Origin is doing a great job. How did you end up there?
I'll say the tallow is our most popular product. So I think many people share that with you, and that we're going back to that. So with the history, sort of paleo, ancestral health, that whole world, I've been in that space for a long time. And then getting into clinical practice, I was actually using a lot of these strategies in my practice and also some products. And so with the ancestral health model, one of the core components is nose to tail eating. Right? So if we look at our hunter-gatherer ancestors, we ate a lot of animals and whatever we could hunt and gather, and nothing went to waste. So we ate every part that we could, and with that included the organ meats. And unfortunately, in the modern day, we no longer really consume those foods. We're mostly consuming just the muscle meat. And so I was incorporating these products into my practice with patients and clients that I worked with. But when I was in Australia, I was actually bringing those products from North America. I was bringing another brand. And I realized that there were some difficulties with that, but Australia has some of the best cattle and beef in the world. And a lot of the products that I was bringing in were from Australia and New Zealand. They get sent to America and then packaged up there and brought here. And so I decided, why don't I look at doing something here? And the other core component that you touched on with that is the regenerative agriculture side. So I think probably like yourself and many people in this space, after years of being in the health space, you start to care a lot more about where your food is coming from, how that supports the larger ecosystems, because even our health as human beings is very much reliant on the planet and the ecosystem. So we have to be cognizant of how we're affecting those systems. And obviously from an ethical perspective, if we decide to eat animals, we want to do that in the best way possible. And so I've become more and more passionate about sustainability, and that led me down the path of regenerative agriculture. And for those who are maybe not familiar with that term and haven't heard of that before, the whole concept of regenerative agriculture, which Alan Savory and a few other people in the space have really pioneered, is this concept of utilizing agriculture in a way that mimics nature to regenerate the land. And so ruminants and grazing animals are a component of that. And it's looking at how they manage them over the land. So they cycle them around. It helps eat the grass, compose it. Obviously, their manure then adds those nutrients back into the ground. So there's a very particular way of managing the land, both animals and plants, so that it helps rebuild the soil, helps rebuild the ecosystem. And the soil is a core component. So really, without soil, we won't have food. We won't have plants. Our whole planet will quickly deteriorate. And unfortunately, this is something that we're seeing now. I think the latest numbers, we only have, I think, maybe 2 or 3 generations left of topsoil in a lot of parts of the world, just due to the way that we're growing food. And that's a lot to do with these monoculture plants. So the whole aspect of ancestral health is shifting away from these Neolithic foods where we started doing more grains. So, the cereals and things like that, we could grow in these massive fields in massive quantities. That was temporarily good. It allowed us to sort of flourish as a society, but it's having quite drastic negative effects on the land. And so regenerative agriculture seeks to go back to this way of regenerating the soil, regenerating the land, so that we can have food for many, many generations moving forward. And so the culmination of all of those passions for me eventually came to me starting Vital Origin, where we provide these nutrient-dense animal-based foods, being the organ meats, and also tallow, which is the beef fat. So people may be familiar with lard. It's very similar to lard, but actually from beef. And so we brought those together, and we continue to try to move that forward and also try to educate people on ancestral health, regenerative agriculture, because I think the education component is such a valuable part. And that's why podcasts and things like this are so great to share that message.
It's amazing. I want to dive into so many different areas. You've mentioned something really important, the topsoil. So I often get asked this question, my nutrition should be enough for my nutrients. And I go, unfortunately, the topsoil isn't that great and we're not going to get enough nutrients from it. And hence why we've got to look at other ways of doing that. And it is because of the topsoil. And that's why we need to support regenerative farming. We've got to get the soil back to where it needs to be. And you're spot on. It's the monocrop culture that actually destroys the soil. I'm going to sidetrack slightly because it's probably a whole conversation on its own, but I want to mention it. And I think it's important to mention because I often have patients who say, well, I just prefer vegetarianism. And it's not because of religious reasons, it's because of ethical, it's because of the killing. And I often get them to watch a few great documentaries, and there's one great podcast which actually talks about the reality of it, of actually what monocrop agriculture does and how it actually destroys thousands of types of animals. If you'd love to make a comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I've talked to lots of people about. Obviously, being in this space, that's something that we get a lot of questions about and a lot of pushback about. But the way that I approach things from, and I think a lot of plant-based people, vegetarians, vegans, we have the same objective, right? We're trying to do the least harm. I think the problem is many people don't look at the bigger picture. Right? They don't look at the secondary, tertiary effects of their choices when they're considering least harm done. So the way that I view things, and I would hope that the data suggests this, because I try to be as unbiased as possible. When we look at the least harm done, it's very clear that monocrop agriculture does more harm to not only animals, insects, and ecosystems overall, but also potentially to our health. But if we're sticking to the ethical perspective, yeah, we have very clear evidence that things like monocrop agricultures kill a lot of rodents, a lot of insects. So a lot of the herbicides and pesticides that they use for these crops end up decimating insect colonies. So we have now the issues with bee colony collapse, butterflies now. So like a lot of our pollinators, which are fundamental to maintaining ecosystems, are getting completely wiped out and killed off because of these herbicides and pesticides. So we're talking about not thousands, but millions of animals potentially dying because of these farming practices versus, one cow that dies that feeds a family for a year, right? Versus, some soybeans or some chickpeas
Or
that
avocados
or whatever, that you need fields and fields and fields of them to have a sufficient amount of calories and nutrients. So the way that I see it is, if we are actually looking at least harm done, then regenerative agriculture, which includes ruminants and the consumption of ruminants, is fundamental to having a sustainable system. And we absolutely can't rely on artificial fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides. Even the fertilizer side now, there's a really growing concern that we're running out of phosphorus and we're running out of a lot of these materials that are needed for these artificial fertilizers. And the reason why they're using artificial fertilizers is because the soil is so depleted, because they just every year keep growing crops that grow in unsustainable ways. And so that topsoil now is eroded in nutrients. So they have to add them back in artificially, right? But eventually we'll run out of that. And so we really need to consider these things when we're talking about our food. There's no such thing as a deathless, right? No matter what you choose,
so true.
Something had to die. And so we need to try to be as conscious about it as possible.
Amazing. I love that answer. I just want to go back to ancestral nutrition. You described what it is. Why is it so important?
So this, funny enough, it's still somewhat of an area of contention, but the basis of ancestral health is really evolutionary biology. So when we look at Homo sapiens, which is us as humans, when we want to consider what is the most optimal way to live, what is the best thing for our health, and even on the spectrum of disease, how do we prevent or cure disease, we need to consider our biology. And the fundamentals of biology is evolution. That's what shaped our physiology and our biology. So when we look at things in that lens from an evolutionary perspective, it really opens our eyes to how we can look at things in our environment now, whether it's our food, where we live, our exposure to light, those types of things. We see very clearly all of a sudden this what's called evolutionary discordance. And so evolutionary discordance is really the fundamental theory around ancestral health, which states that our biology doesn't match our modern environment. And this is what has caused this sudden increase in disease, because it has only been 1 or 2 generations, right? The last 100 years, we've seen chronic degenerative disease skyrocket. So whether it's cancer, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disease, neurodegenerative disease, all these things which weren't really present before are now massive. And we call them diseases of, Western society, or diseases of affluence. And there's been a lot of early research and a lot of people who had traveled the world and sort of journaled and wrote about these indigenous cultures and traditional cultures all around the world that didn't have these diseases of affluence. right? They didn't have high amounts of cardiovascular disease. They didn't have high amounts of cancer. They were actually quite robust and resilient into old age if they survived into old age, right? So that's, I think, the premise of ancestral health is trying to get back to this ancestral way that we lived before, when we were, clear of a lot of these diseases. But how do we apply that in the modern day? I think the quote from Lauren Cordain, if I'm correct, was, we're still Stone Agers living in a space age. And so our body just doesn't really know what's going on. And so we need to realign that back to what our body is meant to be exposed to.
Amazing, amazing. Now, in the last 10 minutes, I have to talk about this because I get asked about meat all the time. It's a surprise for patients. So often they go, what? I'm allowed to eat meat? Meat's actually good for me? And I'm talking about patients who might be in their 30s to in their 70s. And it really took me by surprise. Actually, not by surprise, because I know there's the messaging going out there condoning meat for years. But I didn't realize how prevalent it was, to the point where it actually affected people's lives and they are scared to eat meat. I love to have this conversation with you. I think you're probably one of the best people to have it with. Why are people so scared of eating meat or fat? Yeah.
I think the fat component was probably the big culprit there. There's a lot of programming now, and I think there's a lot of deep ingrained belief systems that are definitely in the older generations somewhat stuck there. But even in the younger generations, I would say that there's a bit of inertia still, and you would know most things in medicine and in science just take time to actually come to clinical practice and to mainstream. And so I think the evidence is definitely shifting, but the issue is early on, fat and things like that was vilified, particularly saturated fat and animal-based saturated fat. So there are some plant sources like coconut things, but the main thing was the saturated fat in animals had been associated with cardiovascular disease. And this was early on from a researcher, Ansel Keys. And so there was the famous 7 countries study, which we're learning now has some downsides to it. It perhaps wasn't the most robust and well done study. In fact, there were many other countries, and there's a lot of confounding variables there. And so, unfortunately, that really set the pace early on, where this research started to shape our food guidelines. And the food guidelines then said, well, animal-based fat is bad. Let's switch that and add in polyunsaturated fats from seed oils, and also switch to more carbohydrates. And so for 50, 60 years plus now, that message has been reinforced over and over and over. And that, I think, has just shaped the general population's approach to food. And that's driven that fear of meat. And now, sadly, as well, there have been quite a few, I'll say documentaries very loosely. My perspective is they're probably more like propaganda, but there's been a lot of these documentaries on Netflix and things like that, which are funded by, very particular people in the industries. And also, I think, misuse the science against what is the consensus to drive more of this fear. And so now we have this sort of social contagion where this message has been pushed out quite a lot. And so people have become very scared about consuming meats and animal-based foods. But again, this is where we can take it back to that ancestral health perspective and use a bit of common sense to try to alleviate that fear. For probably 2 million plus years through our evolution of our Homo genus leading into humans, we hunted and gathered, right? That means we predominantly ate a lot of animals. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest we ate a lot of animals. So our stomach acid is actually more in line with a scavenger or carnivore. So we have very, very acidic stomach acid. And that's because we were scavenging and eating meat that perhaps wasn't very fresh early on. So we needed to kill any particular pathogens. And we also have on the other side now the expensive tissue hypothesis. And so this is something that suggests, and it's a very strong hypothesis, I'd say more theory now, that suggests as we started consuming nutrient-dense animal-based foods that were very rich in things for us to develop as humans, it allowed our stomach to actually shrink because we didn't need to have such a robust digestion for like plant matter. And it allowed our brain, our brain to grow bigger. And so this is a really fundamental theory that suggests why we became humans as we are today is our brain, right? We have the most developed prefrontal cortex and cortex overall out of any of the other great apes. And this theory suggests that that's because we didn't need as much energy for our digestion, and it allowed it to go to our brain, which takes up, I think, something like 20% plus of our energy use, and it's only 2% of our weight. So it uses a lot of energy. So when we look at these types of things, we can see very clearly that there is very strong evidence that we were consuming animals for a very long time. And it doesn't make sense then that suddenly in the last 100 years is the cause of all of this disease, because we've had it in our diet for a very long time, right? We're talking about not even 0.1% of time in our evolutionary past. It doesn't make sense that that could be the cause when we have so many other things that we could look at that are potentially problematic. And again, the statistics show very clearly, since we've actually been reducing our red meat intake, we've increased chicken, we've increased grains, we've increased seed oils, and it's a pretty much one-to-one curve of an increase in chronic degenerative disease. So there's growing information that suggests that good quality grass-fed, grass-finished, pasture-raised animals probably aren't the problem. It's more these confounding variables. And I guess this gets into the issue of, epidemiology versus randomized clinical trials. And so for people who are not familiar, a lot of the nutrition research early on, and even to this day, is epidemiology. And so they're just looking at observations across the population and trying to figure out these correlations.
Exactly, correlation. Wow.
Correlation doesn't mean causation. And so when we look at nutrition research where they're saying red meat is potentially a cause, they're including things like pizza, burgers, fast food, processed meats, etc. They're considering that as red meat. And then the other issue is they're not looking at the healthy user bias or unhealthy user bias. And that's the thing, where other lifestyle factors that people do that maybe are also consuming red meat are the potential factors that are causing the disease, not the red meat.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a lot of issues there. And I would highly recommend people actually read The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Schultz. Yeah, well, she really highlights the whole issue and a lot of the history around this vilification of fat that was probably wrongly done. And yeah, paints a picture of how that happened.
That's amazing. I loved how you mentioned all those topics from Ansel Keys and looking at data, and it's actually more correlation. He missed out of quite a few countries in that correlation.
Yeah, there's actually 22 countries in there. So yeah, some would suggest he's cherry picked some of the data, and there was a few other issues with it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. On a side note, and it's really interesting, the power of messaging. I was just reading this book by Tali Sharrow, and it was called Look Again. And it's really interesting how humans adapt. We're very easy to adapt, and we're also easy to adapt to messaging. And she mentioned something in that book which is really relevant here, the power of repetition. Eventually you'll believe it's true. And that's exactly right. Like, this is 50, 60 years of repetition. And then unfortunately it's entered the dietary guidelines as well. And I have to mention the dietary guidelines is not science-based at all. It's industry-driven.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Fortunately, so people can get quite confused. Well, hold on a sec, I'm just going to the dietary guidelines, why this is not working. And I've been drilled into me in so many different platforms that fat is bad. And I also get this question about, if I eat fat, will I get fat? And I'm gonna get you to comment on that. But it's that power of repetition. And I think that's why platforms like what you're doing is so important to actually get the right message across, because we need to reverse that message. We need to work super hard to reverse that message, because we've got to get the truth out.
Yeah, and it's almost harder to reverse that, right? It's much harder to take someone who already has an ideology and reshape that, versus if they had a fresh, open mind, then we could shape that. So I think it's going to take some time, but we're definitely moving in the right direction, I hope.
Absolutely. And I think when patients see the difference, and it's quite phenomenal, when they see the difference, they actually feel better, they get better. They're no longer low in B12, they're no longer low in iron, they're less inflamed because they are filling their stomachs with meat and animal protein. They're having less grains, less carbs. And as a result, they see inflammation go down. They see mental health improve. They find, they eventually lose weight. I mean, the evidence is you can't even compare what's on research papers to what you actually see in the clinic. And I've actually had vegetarians who initially they thought it was the whole saving the planet, have actually started eating meat, started eating animal protein again. And I actually need to tell the story about a vegetarian came in and she was saying, I have a really healthy diet. I'm really eating cleanly. I'm really healthy diet. But then I didn't say it out loud, but I go, but you're really severely deficient in iron and severely deficient in B12. And unfortunately, you're also severely deficient in vitamin D. And you're complaining of tiredness, insomnia, and anxiety. How can that be healthy? How can your diet be healthy if you're not feeling well? And good on her for taking all this knowledge on board. And, she was quite a strict vegetarian. She started to introduce collagen. And I go, amazing. Amazing. It's just one tiny
Step in
step.
the right direction.
Yeah, one tiny step to start challenging where did my belief system come from? And I'm going to share something quite personal where for years of Indian origin, even though I grew up in the Western world, Indian origin, the whole stigma around beef. There was this massive stigma around beef. And it was only a couple of years ago, Richard, I just suddenly said to myself, hold on a sec, why am I not eating beef? Where did this actually come from? And this was programmed from a young child all over India. Is like, oh my God, the cow is sacred and all of that. And when you really think about it, it was dogma. It was pure dogma. There was nothing in the Hindu culture saying that you can't eat beef. And it was nothing religious at all. It's something that they've created. It's very word of mouth and passed.
So glad you said that.
Passed from generation to generation. And now people can't believe I eat beef every day. Literally never felt better, felt amazing. All my levels are up naturally rather than trying to get it up. And we really got to sometimes think back and say, why are we doing what we're doing? Where did it come from? Have we actually questioned it? Is it hearsay? A lot of it is hearsay. I've been told, but actually start questioning. Why do I think meat is bad? Why do I think eating saturated fats are bad? Let's start questioning it. And I think that's where it's taking ownership and not just following.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree entirely. And that's the whole health journey I think people need to eventually go on, is that self-discovery and starting to ask questions, both of yourself. It's Richard Feynman said, what's the quote? The worst thing you can do is I'm going to bastardize it now. But in the end, it was, you're the easiest person to fool. So people are very easy to trick themselves. And we get stuck into certain belief patterns and dogma. And I think that's a big component that we need to try to avoid. And I think that's what shaped a lot of it. It is dogma, right? And especially in the vegetarian and vegan space, and not to bash anything, but they do get overly involved in the ideology that it becomes part of their personality and their character. And so it becomes very hard to shift out of that, even with very clear evidence, like you said. Right? You've got fatigue, you've got anxiety, depression, low muscle mass, all of these things, which are signs, but yet there's this cognitive dissonance that there's no realization yet that the diet may be the problem. And yeah, it's very difficult, but I think practitioners like yourself, like myself, it's slowly drip it in and slowly try to get that information there. And I think the results speak for themselves, like you said. So people who now are going keto, low carb, more animal based, the results are phenomenal. It's a night and day difference, right? People feel amazing. They lose weight. Every aspect of their health gets better. The caveat to this, and I think why this conversation is still being had and why there is still controversy, is that one marker typically goes up, and that's often LDL. And we're still stuck on this LDL aspect of cardiovascular disease. And I think that's one thing that's still shaping the narrative, where there's still doctors, cardiologists, et cetera, that are very stuck on this diet heart model of saturated fat raises LDL, raises cardiovascular disease. And I think we'll start to see more research come out, like we were talking about before, the lean mass hyperresponders. I think we're starting to get a better picture of what's actually happening there. And hopefully we can start to reshape that a little bit. And there's even the whole LDL paradox, right? Where people who have low LDL seem to actually have a higher risk of all-cause mortality as you get older. And so I think we don't fully understand this picture yet. So as we start to shape that a little bit more, hopefully, the fear drops down more and more people will start to accept that animal-based fats, even high in saturated fat, can actually be healthy, and that we want to start incorporating these foods more and more.
I'm so glad you mentioned it, and I feel like we need to do another podcast on that. But you're absolutely right. And while we've just mentioned it, I think it's important for people, there are audiologists around speaking the truth about cholesterol. And one of them is actually Dr. Ross Walker. And I just recently, eminent cardiologist in Australia, 40 years, he brought coronary artery calcium scores to Australia. And he's done a brilliant webinar, The Truth About Cholesterol. And there was one research on LDL that I want to share with our audience, is that it followed 68,000 people over 10 years and showed once you get over the age of 60, there is no link between LDL and heart disease. And this was published in the BMJ in 2016. And there's actually a lot more data out there just looking at the whole LDL. It's not about total. It's not just about LDL. It's actually more about triglycerides, which is sugar. And it all comes back down to sugar, inflammation, stress,
metabolic dysfunction.
Spot on, rather than just LDL. And I think I'd love to do another podcast on that. But You're spot on. Often people are like, I'm so scared of LDL. And then they go to their GP and the GP says, oh my God, your LDL is so high, but your triglycerides are so low. But no one comments about them because they're doing low carb and good meat, but they're feeling amazing. And I think we talked about David Feldman and his research coming out about that. And I think people need to watch the space, find the right practitioner for them to interpret the results, read the right books. For example, Ross Walker, Asima Holter, Statin-Free Life, Malcolm Kendrick, The Truth About Cholesterol as well. And it's time to question the narrative.
Absolutely. I think that's the fundamental of the scientific method, right? And I think that's where even in science, dogma is sometimes holding us into narratives that are no longer beneficial to us. So hopefully we start to shift more. I think as the data, I'm optimistic that as the data comes out, we will get across there. I think history has shown us that eventually the truth comes out and we do come to a consensus about what the science actually says. So as this starts to come out more and more and what Dave Feldman is doing, I think, we'll start to get a better idea and that fear will start to go down and we'll start to introduce these, amazing nutrient-dense foods back into more people's lives.
Amazing. What an awesome conversation, Richard. I absolutely loved it. And before we let you go, where can people find you?
So they can find me direct on my website or social media. So on my website, it's just richard-game.com. On social media, I usually go by the handle Evolved Health. That's where most of my things are across there. I do have a YouTube channel, which I haven't been very active, but I'm actually trying to do a video a week now. So I'll share more information. And then, of course, I have Vital Origin that people can check out, which is vitalorigin.com.au. And on socials, it's vital.origin.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today, Richard.
Thank you, Shami. It was a pleasure.
Remember that this is general advice only. Please see your healthcare professional for more information. So what's your take-home message today? Remember, it's all about progress and not perfection. And are you suffering from stress? Visit the Usawa Learning Hub on usawa.com.au for more resources on how to de-stress, re-energize, and reclaim your health. Enjoy the journey.